October 15, 2024. Margaret Chen had been teaching room 237 for 16 years. The same desk, the same view, the same careful distance from every student who walked through her door. Derek Morrison raised his hand during Hamlet discussion, asked if she wanted to grab coffee after class. 28 students went silent. Margaret's pen snapped in half. What happened in the next 48 hours would destroy everything she'd built since her breakdown 30 years ago. The school board would hold emergency meetings, parents would demand answers, and the secret she'd buried about Dr. Richard Morrison would surface like a corpse rising from deep water. The psychiatrist who destroyed her mind, the patient files that had disappeared, the son who'd come to finish what his father started. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The broken pen leaked blue ink across Margaret's grade book, spreading like a bruise over her careful annotations. She stared at the jagged plastic pieces in her palm while Derek Morrison's question hung in the air like smoke from a fire she couldn't extinguish. Hot coffee. After class. The words echoed in her mind, but underneath them she heard something else. The steady drip of water in a psychiatric ward bathroom, the whispered promises of a doctor who said he only wanted to help. Her hand trembled as she dropped the pen fragments into her desk drawer next to the emergency Xanax she hadn't touched in 6 months. "Ms. Chen?" Derek's voice carried across the classroom, smooth as honey, patient as a predator. "Did you hear my question?" 28 faces turned toward her, but she could only see one. Derek Morrison sat in the third row, exactly where his father used to position himself during their sessions, close enough to seem concerned, far enough to maintain professional distance. The same calculating blue eyes, the same practiced smile that never quite reached them. "Class dismissed," Margaret whispered. No one moved. "I said class dismissed." Her voice cracked like ice under pressure. The students exchanged glances, gathering their books with unusual slowness, sensing something electric and dangerous in the air. Derek remained seated until the last student filed out. Then he stood, tall and confident, moving toward her desk with the predatory grace she remembered from another Morrison. He placed his hands flat on her desk, leaning forward just enough to invade her space without seeming overtly aggressive. "You look pale, Ms. Chen. Are you feeling all right?" His concern sounded genuine, the same way his father's had sounded when she was 23 and drowning in her own mind. "You need to leave." Margaret's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I'm worried about you. You seem unstable." The word hung between them like a blade. "Maybe you should sit down, take some deep breaths. You know what happens when teachers have episodes at school, right?" The room tilted. Margaret gripped the edge of her desk, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded a panic attack. Unstable. That's what Dr. Morrison had called her when she'd tried to report him. Delusional, experiencing romantic fantasies about her therapist. Classic transference gone wrong. "Who are you?" she breathed. Derek's smile widened, and for a moment his mask slipped. She saw calculation there, cold intelligence, and something that looked disturbingly like hunger. "I'm just a concerned student, Miss Chen, Derek Morrison, though I suppose you knew my father. Dr. Richard Morrison. He mentioned you in his files." The blood drained from Margaret's face. His files were sealed. Were they? Derek pulled out his phone, scrolling through something before turning the screen toward her. She could see her own name at the top of what looked like a medical document. Patient exhibits severe paranoid delusions regarding therapeutic relationship. Claims of inappropriate conduct appear to stem from unresolved trauma and tendency toward fantasy. Margaret lunged for the phone, but Derek pulled it back smoothly, his reflexes quick and sure. The movement sent her stumbling against her desk, knocking over her coffee mug. The dark liquid spread across student essays like blood across snow. "Careful, Miss Chen. You wouldn't want anyone to think you're having another breakdown. Not here, not in front of everyone." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Coffee after school, the grind on Maple Street. We have so much to discuss about my father's work." He straightened his uniform tie and headed for the door, pausing at the threshold. "Oh, And Miss Chen, you might want to clean up that spill. It looks unstable." The door clicked shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Margaret sank into her chair, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. For 30 years she'd built this life. Margaret Chen, respected teacher, reliable colleague, woman who kept her distance and her secrets. She'd changed her name from Margaret Kelly, buried her psychiatric history so deep she'd almost convinced herself it never happened. But Derek Morrison's presence changed everything. He wasn't just some cocky student trying to flirt with his teacher. He was a weapon, carefully aimed and loaded with 30 years of suppressed trauma. His father might be dead. She'd checked the obituaries obsessively for years. But his legacy lived on in those files, in that smile, in the predatory patience that said this was just the beginning. Her hands shook as she reached for her emergency medication, then stopped. She couldn't afford to be medicated for what was coming. Couldn't afford to be anything less than completely alert. Because if Derek Morrison had his father's files, he had everything. The real reason for her breakdown. The incident that had destroyed her ability to trust anyone in authority. The truth about what Dr. Richard Morrison had done to her in that locked room while she was sedated and helpless. And now his son wanted to finish what his father had started. If this psychological thriller is pulling you in, drop a comment letting me know where you're reading from. I love connecting with readers worldwide. And make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's chapter reveals the dark secret Margaret's been hiding for 3 decades. Trust me, you won't want to miss what really happened in that psychiatric ward. Margaret's trembling fingers found the paper towels in her desk drawer, the same drawer that held her emergency medication and the life she'd carefully constructed from the ashes of Margaret Kelly. The coffee had seeped into 30 years of student essays, dissolving the careful red ink corrections she'd made the night before in her small apartment overlooking the academy's manicured grounds. She dabbed at the spreading stain, but her movements were mechanical, disconnected. Her mind had traveled back to that sterile room where everything had changed, where Dr. Richard Morrison's voice had been as smooth as his son's, promising healing while delivering destruction. The paper towel turned brown in her hands, and she realized she was crying. "Breathe," she told herself. "You've survived worse than this." But had she? For 3 decades, Margaret Chen had been a ghost haunting her own life. She'd chosen this profession deliberately. Literature, the safe exploration of other people's emotions through the filter of fiction. She could discuss Ophelia's madness without revealing her own, could teach the bell jar while keeping her own suffocating experiences locked away. The Whitmore Academy had been her sanctuary. Its ivy-covered walls and tradition-soaked halls offered the kind of structured environment that kept the chaos at bay. She'd arrived here 15 years ago with impeccable references and a teaching philosophy centered on the transformative power of words. What she hadn't mentioned was how desperately she needed those words to transform her own fractured reality. Her students respected her, though they found her distant. She never attended faculty parties, never shared details about her weekend plans or family. Because Margaret Chen had no family. She'd severed all ties to Margaret Kelly's life the day she'd walked out of Riverside Psychiatric Hospital with a new name and a story about being an orphan who'd worked her way through college. The only relationship she'd allowed herself was with Elena Rodriguez, the school librarian who'd quietly befriended her during her 2nd year at Whitmore. Elena was the closest thing to family Margaret had now. A warm, maternal woman in her 60s who brought her homemade tamales during parent-teacher conference weeks and never asked probing questions about Margaret's past. Elena was also the person who would be devastated if Margaret's carefully constructed identity crumbled. Last month, Elena had confided that she was considering retirement, but wanted to stay another year to help Margaret through what she'd observed was a particularly stressful period. "You carry too much alone, Mia," Elena had said, her weathered hands gentle on Margaret's shoulders. "But you don't have to." Except she did. Because the truth about Margaret Kelly would destroy not just Margaret Chen, but everyone who'd come to depend on the fiction of her stability. Principal Harrison, who just recommended her for the department head position. Her AP literature students, who were counting on her recommendation letters for their college applications. The parents who trusted her with their children's futures. And Elena, sweet Elena, who'd invited Margaret for Thanksgiving dinner next week, who'd already bought ingredients for Margaret's favorite mole recipe, who treated her like the daughter she'd never had. The coffee stain had reached Derek Morrison's essay on Macbeth, an analysis of guilt and its psychological consequences that had been disturbingly perceptive for a 17-year-old. His handwriting was precise, controlled, nothing like the chaotic scrawl she remembered from his father's prescription pads. But the intelligence behind the words was the same predatory sharpness she'd learned to fear. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from Elena. "Don't forget dinner tonight. Making your favorite enchiladas?" Every Tuesday for 3 years, Margaret had eaten dinner in Elena's cozy apartment above the school library. It was the one constant in her carefully regulated life, the single thread of genuine human connection she'd allowed herself. Elena would want to discuss the upcoming faculty retreat, would probably notice Margaret's pale complexion and shaking hands, would offer herbal tea and gentle concern. How could she sit across from Elena tonight, pretending everything was normal, when Derek Morrison's words echoed in her mind like a death sentence? "You might want to clean up that spill. It looks unstable." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 30 years teaching students about literary foreshadowing, about how authors plant seeds of destruction in their opening chapters. Now she was living inside her own tragic narrative. Watching the careful exposition of her quiet life give way to rising action she was powerless to control. Outside her classroom window, students crossed the quad in their pressed uniforms, their laughter carrying on the autumn wind. Whitmore Academy represented everything she'd thought she wanted: order, respectability, the illusion of safety. But safety was a luxury for people who didn't carry the kind of secrets that could destroy lives. Margaret folded Derek's stained essay and slipped it into her bag. Tonight she would sit with Elena and pretend to care about enchiladas and faculty politics. She would smile and nod and perform the role of Margaret Chen, beloved teacher and trusted friend, because tomorrow Derek Morrison would be waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she was strong enough to give. Margaret had barely touched Elena's enchiladas, pushing the food around her plate while her friend chattered about the new shipment of books for the library. The familiar comfort of Elena's apartment, with its warm terracotta walls and the scent of cinnamon candles, felt like a museum exhibit from a life that no longer belonged to her. "You're not eating, mija," Elena observed, setting down her fork. "Is everything all right?" Margaret forced a smile. "Just tired. Long day with the seniors." "Ah, those college application essays. They're getting more stressed every year." Elena reached across the small table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "You're such a good influence on them. Remember what Mrs. Patterson said at the parent conference? That you changed her son's entire relationship with reading?" The kindness in Elena's voice felt like acid in Margaret's throat. If Elena knew the truth, if she knew that Margaret Chen was built on the bones of Margaret Kelly's destroyed life, would she still speak with such warmth? Margaret's phone buzzed against the table. A text from an unknown number. "Hope you enjoyed dinner. Coffee tomorrow, 4 p.m. The grind. Don't keep me waiting like you kept my father waiting." The blood drained from her face. Elena noticed immediately. "Who is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost, Margaret thought. That's exactly what Derek Morrison was. A specter from a past she'd thought she'd buried so deep it could never claw its way to the surface. It's nothing, just parent concern about grades. But as Margaret stared at the message, something clicked into place with horrible clarity. Derek had mentioned his father's files, but Dr. Richard Morrison had died 8 years ago. She'd seen the obituary, had felt a twisted relief reading about his sudden heart attack. She'd even attended the funeral from the back of the church, needing to see his body in the casket with her own eyes. So how did Derek have access to sealed psychiatric files? Elena was still talking, something about the faculty retreat next weekend, but Margaret's mind was racing. She excused herself to use the bathroom and locked the door behind her. With trembling fingers, she opened her phone's browser and searched for information she'd avoided for years. Dr. Richard Morrison Estate, medical practice closure, patient file disposal. The search results made her stomach drop. According to a medical board document from last year, Dr. Morrison's practice had been under investigation for ethical violations when he died. Multiple former patients had come forward with complaints, but the investigation had stalled when his files went missing during the estate settlement. Missing files that had supposedly been destroyed. but Derek had them. Margaret scrolled deeper, her breath coming in short gasps. There, buried in a legal document about the estate, she found what she was looking for. Dr. Morrison's practice hadn't been dissolved. It had been inherited by his son, Derek Morrison, who had petitioned to access patient files for the purpose of settling outstanding malpractice claims and providing closure to affected families. The legal language was clinical, but the truth was devastating. Derek hadn't stumbled across her files by accident. He'd systematically acquired access to his father's victims. And Margaret wasn't the only one. Her hands shaking, she searched for more information about Derek Morrison himself. The results were sparse. A few mentions in academic achievement lists at Whitmore Academy, a photo from the debate team. But there was something else that made her blood freeze. A news article from 2 years ago, local high school student commended for mental health advocacy. The piece featured Derek speaking at a conference about teen suicide prevention, discussing how his father's work in psychiatry had inspired him to help troubled youth. The accompanying photo showed Derek accepting an award from the state education department, but it was the quote that made Margaret's vision blur. "My father always said that the most damaged people are often the most dangerous when cornered. Understanding their psychology helps us protect society from their instability." Margaret gripped the bathroom sink, her reflection in Elena's antique mirror showing a woman on the verge of collapse. The carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the hollow fear in her eyes, the way her skin had taken on the gray pallor she remembered from her hospital days. A soft knock at the door made her jump. "Margaret, are you feeling sick, Mia?" "I'm fine," she managed, but her voice cracked on the words. She wasn't fine. She would never be fine again. Because Derek Morrison wasn't just his father's son, he was his father's legacy, carrying on Dr. Richard Morrison's work in a new and more sophisticated form. Where his father had used the privacy of a psychiatric practice to manipulate vulnerable patients, Derek was using his position as a student to systematically hunt down his father's victims. Margaret splashed cold water on her face and forced herself to return to the dining room. Elena was clearing the dishes, humming softly under her breath, completely unaware that she was sharing dinner with a target. "I should go," Margaret said. "Early morning tomorrow." Elena hugged her goodbye, the embrace feeling like absolution she didn't deserve. As Margaret walked across the empty quad toward her apartment, Derek's words echoed in her mind. "Don't keep me waiting, like you kept my father waiting." But Margaret Kelly had never kept Dr. Morrison waiting. She'd been an eager patient, desperate for help, trusting completely until the night he'd violated that trust in ways that had shattered her mind. Now his son wanted to finish what his father had started, and this time, Margaret had nowhere to run. Margaret's apartment felt smaller when she returned from Elena's, the walls pressing in like the confines of a hospital room. She double-locked the door and drew the curtains, but the familiar rituals that usually calmed her felt hollow now. Safety was an illusion she could no longer afford. She sat at her kitchen table with Derek's file spread before her, the essay on Macbeth, still stained with coffee, alongside printouts of her frantic internet searches. The evidence painted a picture she'd been too terrified to see clearly. This wasn't random. Derek Morrison had been planning this for months, maybe years. Margaret reached for her emergency medication, then stopped. She needed to think clearly, to understand how deep this went. Instead, she made tea with hands that wouldn't stop trembling and forced herself to review every interaction she'd had with Derek since the semester began. He'd transferred to Whitmore in August, she remembered now. Mid-semester transfers were unusual at a prestigious school like this, requiring exceptional circumstances and stellar grades. Someone had pulled strings to get Derek Morrison into her advanced placement literature class. The realization hit her like ice water. Derek had specifically requested her class. Margaret grabbed her laptop and logged into the school's administrative portal. Her access was limited, but she could view class rosters and enrollment history. There, Derek's transfer request, submitted in June. Under preferred courses, he'd listed only one, AP Literature with Margaret Chen. Her stomach lurched. She scrolled through his academic record, looking for anything that might explain this calculated pursuit. His grades were exceptional, his test scores nearly perfect. but it was his extracurricular activities that made her blood run cold. Peer counseling coordinator, mental health awareness club founder, student liaison for the guidance department's crisis intervention team. Derek Morrison had spent his high school career positioning himself as a helper, a healer, just like his father. And now he had access to vulnerable students, to their files, to their trust. Margaret's phone rang, startling her so violently that she knocked over her tea. Elena's name appeared on the screen. "Mia, I'm worried about you. You left your scarf here, and you seem—" "I'm fine, Elena. Just tired." "No, you're not fine. I've seen that look before." Elena's voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd spent decades working with troubled teenagers. "Talk to me." Margaret pressed her eyes shut. Elena had indeed seen that look before, on the faces of students who came to the library seeking refuge from bullies, from family problems, from the crushing weight of adolescent despair. Elena was a safe harbor, which made this betrayal even more impossible to bear. "It's just work stress. The college application season." "Margaret Chen, I've known you for 15 years. This isn't about college applications." Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Margaret could tell Elena everything about Margaret Kelly, about Dr. Morrison, about the son who was now hunting her with surgical precision. Elena would believe her, would try to help, and that help would destroy them both. "No trouble," Margaret managed. "I promise." After Elena hung up, Margaret sat in the dark kitchen, staring at her phone. She'd lied to the one person who genuinely cared about her, and the deception felt like another small death. But Elena's concern had revealed something crucial. Other people were watching now. Her behavior at dinner, her obvious distress, it was noticeable. If she fell apart publicly, Derek wouldn't need to expose her psychiatric history. Everyone would see Margaret Kelly bleeding through the cracks of Margaret Chen's carefully constructed facade. Margaret returned to her laptop, searching for any mention of Derek's previous schools. What she found made her hands shake so violently she could barely type. Before transferring to Whitmore, Derek had attended 3 different schools in 2 years. Each transfer coincided with what the news reports euphemistically called student wellness concerns. A guidance counselor at his previous school had committed suicide. A teacher had taken sudden medical leave after what was described as a nervous breakdown. Another educator had simply disappeared mid-semester, leaving no forwarding address. Margaret stared at the screen until the words blurred together. This was Derek Morrison's pattern: identify vulnerable targets with connections to his father's work, then systematically destroy them. The son was more sophisticated than the father had ever been, using the very institutions designed to help people as hunting grounds. Her laptop pinged with a new email. The sender's address was unfamiliar, but the subject line made her blood freeze. "Looking forward to our conversation." The message was brief: "Sleep well, Miss Chen. Tomorrow we discuss my father's legacy and your role in preserving it." Margaret slammed the laptop shut, but the damage was done. Derek Morrison had invaded her home, her sanctuary, her last refuge from a past she'd thought was buried. She climbed into bed fully clothed, clutching her phone like a lifeline. But when she finally fell asleep near dawn, her dreams were filled with sterile rooms and gentle voices promising help while delivering destruction. She'd forgotten to close properly. Her phone still clutched against her chest like a talisman that had failed to protect her. The dreams clung to her consciousness: white walls, the scratch of pens on clipboards, Dr. Morrison's voice explaining why she needed to trust him completely. But it was Derek's face that had haunted the final moments before waking, wearing his father's predatory smile. She stumbled to the bathroom and stared at her reflection. The woman looking back was a ghost, hollow-eyed, gray-skinned, trembling. This was Margaret Kelly bleeding through, the broken 23-year-old who'd trusted the wrong person and paid a price that had cost her everything. Her phone buzzed. A text from Derek: "See you at 4. Bring your appetite for honesty." Margaret's hands shook as she typed back, "I can't meet today." The response was immediate: "Then I'll come to you. Your apartment is charming, by the way. Great view of the library." Ice flooded her veins. He'd been watching her building, knew where she lived, had probably seen her return from Elena's last night. The violation felt complete. No space was safe anymore. At school, Margaret moved through her morning classes like a sleepwalker. During her planning period, she found herself standing in the guidance office, staring at the wall of mental health resources that Derek had helped organize. Suicide prevention hotlines, crisis intervention pamphlets, all arranged with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly how broken people sought help. "Miss Chen?" The voice belonged to Sarah Wright, the head guidance counselor. "Are you all right? You look pale." Margaret forced a smile. "Just wondering about one of my students, Derek Morrison. How well do you know him?" Sarah's expression brightened immediately. "Derek's wonderful. Such a compassionate young man. He's helped design half our peer counseling programs." "Why do you ask?" "He's very perceptive in his writing. Sometimes I worry about students who understand psychology too well." "Oh, Derek comes by it naturally. His father was a psychiatrist, you know. Derek's thinking about following in his footsteps." Sarah leaned closer conspiratorially. "Between you and me, we could use more mental health professionals who understand teenagers. Derek has such insight into troubled students." Margaret's vision blurred. "What kind of insight?" "He can spot the ones who are struggling before they even ask for help. Last week, he identified a sophomore who was having suicidal thoughts just from observing her behavior in the cafeteria. Probably saved her life." The room tilted around Margaret. Derek wasn't just hunting his father's old victims. He was creating new ones, selecting vulnerable students and positioning himself as their savior. The guidance office suddenly felt like another sterile room, another place where trust was weaponized. "I should get back to class," Margaret managed. During lunch, she sat in her empty classroom, unable to eat. The sandwich Elena had packed for her, homemade bread with turkey and Margaret's favorite mustard, tasted like sawdust. Even Elena's kindness felt contaminated now, another thing Derek could destroy with a few words. Margaret's laptop chimed with an email from Principal Harrison. "Margaret, could you stop by my office after school? I have some exciting news about the department head position." The timing was obscene. Her entire life was unraveling, and the career she'd built was reaching its pinnacle. In any other week, Harrison's email would have filled her with pride. Now it felt like another trap closing. She spent her last class period watching Derek from the corner of her eye. He participated normally, offered thoughtful insights about a crucible and the psychology of mass hysteria. His classmates clearly respected him. Several sought his opinion on their essay drafts, and Margaret watched him offer gentle, helpful feedback. But when their eyes met across the classroom, his smile held the same cold calculation she remembered from his father. The other students saw a compassionate peer counselor. Margaret saw a predator who'd learned to perfect his camouflage. After the final bell, Margaret gathered her papers with trembling hands. Derek lingered as the other students filed out, his presence filling the room like a toxic gas. "Nervous about our coffee date, Miss Chen?" His voice was perfectly pleasant, loud enough for any passing students to hear. "I'm really looking forward to discussing my career goals with you." "I have a meeting with Principal Harrison," she said. "That's fine. We have all the time in the world." Derek shouldered his backpack with casual confidence. "My father always said patience was essential when working with damaged people. Rush them, and they break completely." Margaret's hands stilled on her papers. "Your father said that?" "Among other things. He kept very detailed notes about his patients, you know. Their fears, their weaknesses, their breaking points." Derek moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. He was particularly thorough with the ones who interested him most. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Dr. Morrison hadn't just violated her trust. He'd documented her destruction, turned her trauma into clinical notes that his son now possessed like a roadmap to her soul. Derek headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, and Miss Chen? Principal Harrison's very excited about recommending you for department head. It would be such a shame if something changed his mind about your stability." The classroom door closed behind Derek with a soft click that sounded like the final tumbler in a lock. Margaret stared at the empty doorway, her papers scattered across her desk like evidence of a crime she couldn't name. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the harsh glare that reminded her too much of hospital corridors. He was particularly thorough with the ones who interested him most. Margaret's breath came in shallow gasps as the full weight of Derek's words settled over her. Dr. Morrison's notes, She'd forgotten about the notes. Every session, every breakthrough, every moment of vulnerability had been recorded in clinical detail. She could still see his pen scratching across yellow legal pads, documenting her fears with the precision of an entomologist pinning butterflies. But there was something else niggling at the edge of her memory, something that didn't align with Derek's carefully constructed narrative. Margaret closed her eyes and forced herself back to that sterile office 30 years ago, past the trauma and terror to the actual chronology of events. Dr. Morrison had taken notes, yes, extensive notes, but those notes had been subpoenaed during the medical board investigation that followed her formal complaint. She remembered the lawyer explaining how the files would be sealed, how her identity would be protected, how justice would finally... Margaret's eyes snapped open. The medical board investigation. She'd been the one who'd filed the complaint against Dr. Morrison. She'd been the one who'd testified, who'd provided evidence, who'd demanded accountability. The case had been sealed to protect her privacy, but it had proceeded, and Dr. Morrison had lost his license. Her hands trembling, Margaret pulled out her phone and searched for information she'd been too afraid to seek before. The medical board records were public, even if the details were redacted. What she found made her stomach lurch, but not in the way she'd expected. Dr. Richard Morrison's license had been revoked in 1995, 3 years after Margaret's complaint. He'd never practiced medicine again. The investigation had found evidence of violations with multiple patients, and he died in 2018, not as a respected psychiatrist, but as a disgraced former doctor whose final years had been spent working as a night shift security guard. Margaret scrolled further, her pulse hammering. If Dr. Morrison had lost his license, had no practice to inherit, then how had Derek accessed patient files that would have been destroyed years ago? How could he possess the detailed psychological profiles he claimed to have? The answer hit her like ice water. He couldn't. Derek Morrison was bluffing. Margaret's mind raced, reframing every interaction through this new lens. Derek's knowledge of her past wasn't gleaned from his father's notes. It was constructed from publicly available information and psychological manipulation. Her breakdown at 23, her hospitalization, even her name change could be pieced together through careful research and social engineering. Derek had enough general knowledge to seem omniscient while fishing for specific details that only Margaret herself could provide. Rush them, and they break completely. Those weren't Dr. Morrison's words about his patients. They were Derek's words about his targets. A methodology he developed himself, refined through practice on other vulnerable educators who'd been too terrified to see through his deception. Margaret thought about the guidance counselor's suicide, the teacher's nervous breakdown, the educator who'd disappeared. What if they hadn't been Dr. Morrison's former patients at all? What if Derek simply identified vulnerable people and convinced them he possessed damaging information about their pasts? The revelation should have been liberating. But instead Margaret felt a different kind of terror settling over her. If Derek was operating without his father's files, that meant his knowledge of psychology was intuitive, self-taught, potentially more dangerous than anything Dr. Morrison had ever possessed. He'd looked at Margaret, and somehow identified her as a former psychiatric patient, without any clinical documentation to guide him. Her phone buzzed with another text. Principal Harrison seemed very interested when I mentioned my concerns about your recent behavior. Don't keep me waiting. Margaret stared at the message, seeing it clearly for the first time. Derek wasn't threatening to reveal documented evidence of her psychiatric history. He was threatening to make Harrison question her mental stability based on his own carefully crafted observations. No files necessary, just a concerned student reporting troubling behavior from a teacher who'd been acting strangely. The beauty of his method was its simplicity. Derek didn't need proof of Margaret's past to destroy her present. He just needed to plant seeds of doubt in the right minds, to be the compassionate student worried about his teacher's well-being. And if Margaret defended herself too vigorously, if she seemed paranoid or unstable, she'd be providing the very evidence Derek claimed to already possess. Margaret gathered her papers with steady hands for the first time all week. Derek Morrison was dangerous. Potentially more dangerous than his father had ever been. But he'd made one crucial mistake in his arrogance. He'd revealed the emptiness behind his threats. My father always said patience was essential when working with damaged people. But Margaret wasn't damaged anymore. She was angry. Margaret walked to Principal Harrison's office with purposeful steps, her mind crystallizing around a plan she'd never thought herself capable of forming. The anger coursing through her veins felt foreign after decades of careful control, but it was clean, cleaner than the fear that had been poisoning her for days. Harrison's door was open, and he looked up from his computer with the pleased expression of a man about to deliver good news. "Margaret, come in, sit down. I have wonderful developments to share." She took the offered chair, noting how different this felt from sitting across from Dr. Morrison 30 years ago. Harrison was transparent in his intentions, genuine in his respect for her work. The contrast made Derek's manipulation feel even more obscene. "The District Review Committee has been incredibly impressed with your leadership during the literacy initiative," Harrison continued. "They're prepared to offer you the department head position effective next semester, along with a substantial salary increase." Margaret felt the weight of 3 decades of careful reconstruction, the career she'd built, the reputation she'd earned, the life she'd created from the ashes of Margaret Kelly's destruction. All of it real, all of it hers. "That's wonderful news, David. I'm honored by their confidence." Harrison's smile faltered slightly. "You don't seem as excited as I expected. Are you having second thoughts about the position?" Here was Derek's trap laid bare, the concerned administrator noticing behavioral changes in a valued teacher. Margaret could see how easily a seed of doubt, planted by a worried student, could grow into something that consumed everything she'd worked for. "Actually, I wanted to discuss something with you," she said, her voice steadier than it had been in days. "I'm concerned about a student who may be manipulating other students and staff." Harrison's expression shifted to professional attention. "Go on." "Derek Morrison has been making increasingly inappropriate contact with me outside of normal academic interactions. He's also positioned himself unusually close to vulnerable students through the peer counseling program." Margaret chose her words carefully, sticking to observable facts. "I'm worried he may be using psychological manipulation techniques that could be harmful." "Those are serious allegations, Margaret. Derek has an excellent reputation with our counseling staff." "Which is exactly what makes him effective. He's extremely intelligent and sophisticated in his approach." Margaret leaned forward. "I think we need to examine the pattern of his previous school transfers. Each one coincided with mental health crises among staff or students." Harrison's pen paused over his notepad. "You're suggesting Derek was involved in those incidents?" "I'm suggesting someone with his access and psychological awareness could easily identify vulnerable targets and exacerbate their existing struggles while appearing to help." The words felt dangerous leaving her mouth, but also liberating. She was fighting back using truth instead of cowering before lies. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "What exactly has Derek done that concerns you?" Margaret had anticipated this question. "He's been texting me personal messages, trying to arrange private meetings outside school hours. He's made comments that suggest he's been researching my background extensively, and he's demonstrated knowledge about psychological trauma that seems designed to unsettle rather than help. Have you documented these interactions?" "Yes." Margaret pulled out her phone, showing Harrison the text messages Derek had sent. Without the context of her hidden past, they looked exactly like what they were: inappropriate contact from a student who was overstepping boundaries. Harrison's expression grew grave as he read. "These are definitely inappropriate. I'll need you to forward these to me for documentation. Of course, Margaret, why didn't you come to me sooner? This behavior should have been reported immediately." The question struck at her deepest shame, the fear that had kept her silent, the assumption that she was helpless. But sitting here now, watching Harrison take her concerns seriously, Margaret realized how much power she'd given Derek by believing his illusions. "I was hoping I could handle it myself," she admitted. "I didn't want to cause problems for a student who's supposedly helping others. Students who manipulate staff need intervention, not protection. You did the right thing coming forward now." Margaret felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of fear that had been tightening for days. Derek's power over her had been built on isolation and shame. But sitting in Harrison's office, being believed and supported, she could see how small Derek's actual ammunition really was. "I'd like to arrange a meeting with Derek's previous counselors," Harrison continued. If there's a pattern of behavior, we need to understand it fully before deciding how to proceed. As Margaret left Harrison's office 20 minutes later, she felt the unfamiliar sensation of walking toward conflict instead of away from it. Derek was waiting for her in the hallway, his expression confident and predatory. "How did your meeting go, Miss Chen? You look different." Margaret looked at him, really looked, and saw not the omniscient threat she'd feared, but a clever, damaged young man who'd learned to weaponize other people's pain because he couldn't face his own. "Yes," she said quietly, "I imagine I do." Derek's confident smile wavered for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty that told Margaret everything she needed to know. He'd expected her to emerge from Harrison's office defeated, perhaps having sabotaged her own career through paranoid accusations. Instead, she stood before him transformed, no longer the cowering victim he'd been systematically dismantling. "You reported me," he said, his voice losing its practiced warmth. "That wasn't very smart, Miss Chen." "No," Margaret replied calmly. "What wasn't smart was believing you had any real power over me." Derek stepped closer, his mask slipping further. "You have no idea what I'm capable of, what my father documented about you." "Your father lost his medical license in 1995, Margaret interrupted. "He died working as a security guard. Any files he might have kept were destroyed years ago, and you know it." The color drained from Derek's face. For the first time since their interactions began, Margaret saw genuine shock in his eyes, the look of a predator realizing his prey had turned to face him. "You think you're so clever," he whispered, glancing around the empty hallway. "But I don't need his files. I can see what you are just by looking at you. Broken, fragile. One conversation with Harrison about your episodes in class, your paranoid behavior." "Which episodes?" Margaret's voice remained steady. "The ones where I've been an exemplary teacher for 30 years. The paranoid behavior that led Harrison to offer me the department head position 20 minutes ago?" Derek's composure cracked completely. "You're lying. Check with him yourself. Ask him how concerned he was about my mental stability when he offered me the promotion." Margaret took a step forward, claiming space instead of yielding it. "Or better yet, explain to him why you've been texting me inappropriate messages and trying to arrange private meetings." "Those messages," Derek started, then stopped, realizing his mistake. He'd never explicitly stated what was in those texts. His knowledge of their content was self-incriminating. Margaret watched the calculation in his eyes shift from predatory confidence to desperate damage control. This was Derek's fundamental flaw, the same one that had destroyed his father. He'd become so intoxicated by his own power that he'd overplayed his hand, revealed too much, pushed too hard. "You manipulated me into silence by making me believe you possessed information about my past," Margaret said. "But the only power you ever had was the power I gave you by being afraid." "This isn't over," Derek snarled, his composure completely shattered now. "You think reporting me changes anything? I'll destroy your career, your reputation." "With what evidence?" Margaret's voice cut through his threats like a blade. "Accusations from a student who's been stalking his teacher? Claims made by someone whose previous schools coincidentally had multiple mental health crises among staff?" Derek's eyes widened. She'd been investigating him while he thought he was hunting her. "That's right," Margaret continued. "While you've been playing your psychological games, I've been doing actual research. Riverside Academy, Millfield Prep, Westbrook High. Every school you've attended has reported unusual incidents. Teacher breakdowns, student suicides, mysterious behavioral changes among staff and vulnerable students." "You can't prove anything," Derek said, but his voice had lost its venom, replaced by something Margaret recognized from her own mirror, the sound of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse. "I don't need to prove anything. I just need to document patterns and let trained professionals investigate." Margaret felt 30 years of fear and self-doubt crystallizing into something harder, stronger. "The guidance counselor at Riverside who killed herself. Sarah mentioned you identified troubled students before they asked for help. How many of them were struggling before they met you, Derek? And how many only started struggling after?" Derek's face had gone ashen. "You don't understand. They were already broken. I was trying to help them see." See what? That they were as damaged as you are? Margaret's voice softened with something that might have been pity. You learned to weaponize other people's trauma because you couldn't face your own. Your father didn't just lose patience, Derek. He lost you too. The words hit their mark. Derek's carefully constructed facade shattered completely, revealing the frightened, wounded child beneath. For a moment, Margaret saw past his manipulation to the real tragedy. A boy destroyed by his father's crimes, warped into recreating them with even more sophistication. "I'm not him," Derek whispered. But the protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. "No," Margaret agreed. "You're worse. He violated boundaries with vulnerable patients. You create the vulnerability first, then exploit it." Derek looked around the hallway desperately, perhaps realizing that everything he'd built at Whitmore Academy was collapsing around him. His reputation, his access to victims, his carefully cultivated image, all of it crumbling because he'd finally chosen a target who refused to remain broken. "Principal Harrison is expecting you in his office," Margaret said quietly. "I suggest you don't keep him waiting." As Derek walked away on unsteady legs, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since she was 23 years old. Complete, unqualified victory over the darkness that had tried to claim her. Margaret stood alone in the hallway after Derek disappeared around the corner, watching the late afternoon light filter through the windows she'd walked past countless times over 3 decades. The familiar sounds of Whitmore Academy, distant conversations, locker doors closing, the soft hum of the heating system, wrapped around her like a protective embrace. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, yet she felt fundamentally altered, as if she'd stepped out of a shadow she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The next few weeks passed in a blur of administrative meetings and careful documentation. Derek Morrison was quietly withdrawn from Whitmore Academy, his transfer expedited with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested Harrison's investigation had uncovered more than Margaret ever knew. She never learned the full details, and found she didn't need to. The weight of his presence simply lifted from the school like fog burning off in sunlight. Margaret accepted the department head position with a clear conscience and steady hands. The irony wasn't lost on her. Derek's attempt to destroy her career had inadvertently forced her to claim more of it. She threw herself into the work with renewed purpose, developing new protocols for identifying student mental health concerns and ensuring proper professional boundaries were maintained. It felt like penance and healing in equal measure. 3 months later, Margaret sat in her newly appointed office, reviewing applications for a junior faculty position. The late autumn light streaming through her windows reminded her of that day in the hallway, and she paused in her work to watch students moving across the courtyard below. They looked so young, so vulnerable in ways they couldn't yet understand. She thought of Derek, not with hatred, but with a complex sadness for the child he'd been before his father's toxicity had warped him beyond recognition. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah Martinez, the school counselor, stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of tea. "You looked like you could use this," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk. "How are you adjusting to the administrative life?" "Better than expected." Margaret accepted the tea gratefully. "Though I miss being in the classroom full-time. The students miss you too." Emma Hartley asked if you might consider leading a creative writing workshop next semester. Margaret smiled, remembering the quiet girl who'd slowly blossomed under encouragement. "I'd like that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Sarah spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking about what happened with Derek Morrison, how he managed to fool so many of us for so long." Margaret set down her cup carefully. People like Derek are skilled at showing others what they want to see. But you saw through him. Eventually. Margaret looked out the window again, though not as quickly as I should have. "Maybe that's what made the difference," Sarah said thoughtfully. "You understood what it felt like to be vulnerable, to have someone exploit that vulnerability. It gave you insight the rest of us lacked." Margaret had never considered it that way, that her greatest wound might also have been her greatest protection. The breakdown at 23, the years of rebuilding, the constant vigilance against her own fragility, all of it had taught her to recognize the particular cruelty of someone who weaponized healing. "I got a letter from Riverside Academy last week," Sarah continued. They've reopened their investigation into their counselor's suicide. Apparently, several former students have come forward with concerns about Derek's behavior during his time there. Margaret nodded, unsurprised. She'd suspected Derek's trail of damage stretched further than any of them knew. I hope they find peace. They credited you with giving them the courage to speak up. Your willingness to confront him showed them it was possible to fight back. After Sarah left, Margaret remained at her desk as the daylight faded. She thought about the woman she'd been 30 years ago, Margaret Kelly, bright and trusting, destroyed by someone who should have protected her. Then she thought about Margaret Chen, the identity she'd built from necessity and maintained through careful distance from anything that might threaten her stability. But sitting here now, in an office that represented recognition of her strength rather than accommodation of her weakness, she realized she'd become someone new, someone who could carry the scars of Margaret Kelly's trauma without being defined by them, who could honor Margaret Chen's hard-won stability while still taking risks worth taking. The last light disappeared from her windows and Margaret gathered her papers, preparing to go home to her small apartment with its carefully chosen books and quiet routines. She would water her plants, prepare a simple dinner, and perhaps read some of the student writing submissions that had been piling up on her desk. It wasn't the life she'd imagined at 23, before everything went wrong, but it was a good life, earned through decades of small acts of courage, and she was finally ready to live it without apology. Margaret turned off her office light and stepped into the hallway, her footsteps echoing softly in the peaceful quiet of Whitmore Academy. She was going home,